A group of men with no king, no law, no borders. And within 300 years, they conquered 3 continents. But then everything collapsed. Not because of war, not because of a stronger enemy, but because they destroyed themselves. So what created a civilization that terrified the entire world? And what killed it?
Year 793. A small monastery on the coast of England. Monks were caring for their sacred treasures, precious books, church valuables. For nearly 400 years, no one had dared attack these places. Then they arrived. Ships unlike anything ever seen, swords cutting through the air, screaming. And when it was over, Lindisfarne, the most famous monastery in Europe, was completely destroyed. Europe trembled. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And most importantly, when would they return? But history loves to be ironic. The most terrifying invaders would become the greatest builders, and their destruction would come from a place completely unexpected.
To understand Vikings, you have to forget what you think you know. They weren't savage tribes living in caves, they weren't mindless murderers with no purpose, and they certainly weren't what Hollywood describes. They were the result of a system, a perfect system. Why did some Scandinavians, from Poland, from Sweden, from Norway, decide to spread out from their snow-covered lands? The answer isn't inherent savagery, it's geography, it's economics, it's desperation. 8th century Scandinavia wasn't a nice place to live. Land was sparse, winters were brutally long, and most importantly, no gold, no silver, nothing the world actually needed. But look west, look south, there's plenty of everything. Churches filled with gold, rich cities drowning in complacency, countries with no strong armies, no modern weapons. A perfect opportunity. But opportunity doesn't knock on doors by itself. You need something to start with, and Vikings had it. They possessed a skill that no one else in Europe had: ships.
Imagine you're a Viking captain around 800. You look down at your ship, a Longship, a name the world would fear for 300 years. It wasn't like other ships in the world, not the heavy, slow merchant vessels of the Mediterranean. The Longship was a revolution. It was thin, only about 3 meters wide, but longer than 30 meters. Strange? Yes, but there's a reason. This design meant the ship needed very little water, shallow water, so it could navigate up rivers, not just large rivers, small rivers, rivers you wouldn't believe a military vessel could enter. Imagine you're a French farmer around 850. You live about 50 kilometers from the Rhine River. You feel safe. You think if invaders come, you'll hear about it first. You'll have time to run, to fight, to live. Then one morning, you wake up and see about 50 longships on the water, outside your town, on a river where they shouldn't be able to exist. You've lost your advantage, instantly. But the Longship wasn't just about shallow water. It had another strength. It could be pulled onto beaches. Within an hour, 100 ships could be pulled from the water. 200 ships could be buried to hide them from sight. An invader couldn't bury their ship offshore. A Longship could. That's it. That's the secret. Not some overwhelming power, not fearless warriors. It's about technology designed perfectly. And when you have superior technology, everything else becomes possible.
These ships started on the Volga River, started on the Thames River, started on the Seine River. And when they arrived, they didn't just come to raid and leave. They came to stay. In 865, a group of Vikings, later called the Great Heathen Army, landed in England. They didn't arrive with 100 ships. They arrived with 500. Not to plunder a single monastery, but to conquer a nation. And the amazing part? They had a plan. Vikings weren't random sea pirates. History has lied to you. They were organized military forces. They had vision. They had strategy. Their victories weren't due to luck. They were due to how they organized. Each ship carried about 60 warriors. Each warrior was trained since childhood. Each attack, planned
planned and executed with military precision. An English defense? Local people, farmers conscripted into battle, untrained, disorganized, just terrified. You don't need a bigger army when your army is 10 times better.
But let me pause. Imagine you're a Viking, not a leader, not a king, just an ordinary sailor. You're from where? From a small tribe in Norway. You don't own land, you don't have gold. You have an axe, a shield, a cold calculation in your blood. And what are you promised? Wealth across the ocean, fame, maybe a piece of land in a country you will conquer. Now imagine you're an English farmer. You live in a small house. You grow wheat. You raise pigs. Every year you give a portion of your harvest to the local nobility. That's your life. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. Then you hear news. Strangers are coming. People with swords. People with no mercy. You can run. You can hide. You can pray. Or, and here's the funny part, you can surrender. Because that's what many people did. Not because they were weak, but because it was the only choice that made sense. Get slaughtered into pieces or live under a new master. Most people chose to live.
And here's what's interesting about Vikings. They weren't bad administrators. Once they conquered a place, they stayed, they built, they married, they had children. They became part of that land. It's called settlement. And it happened everywhere. In England, they took much of the East. In France, their lands became Normandy. In Italy, they established kingdoms. In Russia, they founded cities. In Iceland, they established permanent settlements. Within just 100 years, from invaders, they became part of the countries they'd conquered. But this success, both glorious and strange, contained the seeds of collapse, seeds planted very early.
Why could Vikings conquer so much? You know, it wasn't weapons. It wasn't advanced military tactics. They didn't have those. It wasn't numbers either. They were always outnumbered. It was psychology. An English person in 900 was terrified, not because they'd seen a Viking, but because they'd heard stories. Stories about what these terrifying ships could do. Stories retold. Stories with details added. Fear was Vikings' greatest weapon. But fear has a problem. Eventually, it fades. People start fighting back. They build walls. They organize armies. They learn to resist. And when you learn to resist fear, you start winning.
Enter the 10th and 11th centuries. The days of easy victories were over. Now, war was difficult. Larger ships were built to counter Viking vessels. Alliances formed. Kings began resisting. Old Vikings would have to adapt or die. Many died, but some adapted. They became mercenaries. They became local kings. They became part of the system. And when you become part of a system, you're no longer outside that system. That's when Viking tribes began to fade, not because of a great battle, but because each tribe began caring only about themselves.
Imagine you're a Viking king around 950. You've conquered Normandy. You have created your own army. You have a power base. You have children. Now your father, a great conqueror, sends word. He wants you to conquer more. He wants you to send your soldiers. He wants you to risk the empire you've built. What will you do? Send your soldiers to die somewhere just to please an old man? Or will you say no? Many said no.
That's when everything started to fall apart. Vikings were never really unified into one empire. They were hundreds of different tribes, hundreds of different kings, each with their own interests. When they were unified by fear, when all of Europe was terrified, they were unstoppable. But when fear faded, when victories became demands for glory, each Viking king began thinking about protecting themselves. And you can't build an empire on self-preservation. An empire needs a common purpose. It needs a common enemy. It needs to be maintained by things other than violence. Vikings didn't have those things.
In the 11th century, what happened wasn't dramatic collapse. It wasn't a fierce battle. It wasn't a revenge scheme. It was slow disintegration. Viking tribes began staying only in the territories they'd conquered. They began using local names. They began speaking local languages. They began worshiping local gods. They began marrying locals, not to conquer, but to integrate. Within 2 or 3 generations, nothing recognizable as Viking remained. The conquerors became the conquered, not by weapons, but by territory, by responsibility, by life.
And now, the final question. Those ships, the things that started everything, what happened to them? They vanished. No one built them anymore. Vikings came ashore. They became farmers, merchants, craftsmen. They didn't need ships anymore. The technology disappeared, not because anyone banned it, but because it wasn't necessary anymore. It didn't serve a purpose. And then, something strange happened. Vikings began fearing the ships. Viking ships. Ships of their ancestors. Ships of their parents. Ships of themselves.
So what does all this mean? How did a civilization that terrified all of Europe destroy itself? It wasn't one single mistake. It wasn't one single enemy. It was that what created their success became their defeat. Vikings conquered because they had no attachments, no fixed structure, no nation, just ships, swords, and a purpose. But when you conquer territories, you need structures, you need laws, you need a system. You need things Vikings had long rejected. And when Viking tribes began building those structures, they stopped being what made them Viking. That's the reason. That's the system. Not an accident, but an inevitable law.
But here's what's strange. Vikings' impact remains. Today, if you live in England, you speak a language that's nearly half Old Norse words. If you live in France, your nobility all have Viking blood flowing through them. If you live in Italy, the foundations of your local government were established by Vikings. They never really disappeared. They just became us. Question for you. If you had unstoppable powers, something that made you invincible, and to maintain that power you had to give it up, what would you do? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget, subscribe. And if you want to know about specific Viking figures, people like Ragnar Lothbrok, Eric the Red, Ivar the Boneless, you won't want to miss the next video, because their stories aren't what history teaches you. See you there. Thank you.